Well, good afternoon. My name is Nicholas Allen. I'm Director of the Wilson Center for Humanities and Arts at the University of Georgia. And I'm really delighted to welcome my friend and fellow scholar, Emanuel, to give this year's Odum Environmental Ethics Lecture on the swamp, Indigenous erasure, environmental justice, and the transformation of North Carolina's coastal plain. We'll be recording this conversation today, and we will also be able to accept questions afterwards, but could you do that please to the Q&A function, which I will be doing my best to keep an eye upon. And we will have a good conversation with Ryan afterwards. I've known Ryan now for a number of years, and I follow his work very closely on social media and in his scholarship. And I've always admired his blend of the humanities, the arts, and the sciences together. And it's wonderful that we have this beautiful image by Ryan's mother here to begin the conversation. Ryan is Associate Professor of Hydrology in Duke University's Nicholas School of the Environment. And he was known really for his innovative scholarship on water, environmental justice, and Indigenous rights. Before his January 22 appointment to Duke, he led the Ecohydrology and Watershed Science Lab at North Carolina State University, where he was a university faculty scholar and professor in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources, and a faculty fellow at the Center for Geospatial Analytics. He's also been a fellow at the National Humanities Center. A prolific researcher with nearly 50 peer-reviewed publications to his credit, he is widely cited for his studies on water and biogeochemical cycles in mountain landscapes, the effects of saltwater intrusion in coastal freshwater ecosystems, and the impacts of climate change and land use change on Indigenous lands and communities. Ryan is an enrolled member of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, and he frequently combines tools and ideas from both the academic tradition and Indigenous knowledge systems in his studies and teaching. And just before we start, I also wanted to thank my colleague and friend, Alfie Vick, for the work that he does in the Environmental Ethics Certificate at the University of Georgia, a long distinguished program that teaches many students about these diversity of experiences and perceptions, and also my colleagues in the Institute of Native American Studies, who do such a wonderful job of sharing with our students and our faculty and our community the deep histories, languages, cultures, traditions, and knowledges of this place. But for this year's 2022 Odum Environmental Ethics Lecture, I wanted to welcome my friend, Ryan Emanuel. Ryan, thank you for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. And I want to thank the University of Georgia, the Wilson Center, and the Environmental Ethics Certificate Program. I'm honored to speak with you about a project that I've been working on for a few years now. This work really began as a response to a sense of despair that I felt among communities that I worked with in the coastal plain around issues that were linked to pollution, unsustainable development, and climate change. The coastal plain's a beautiful place. It's where land and water mix, and this painting by my mom hints at that. In today's talk, I want to highlight both the beauty and the fragility of the coastal plain as I see it, but I also want to circle around eventually to some important themes related to Indigenous rights and environmental justice. In particular, the thesis that I want to offer today is this: the erasure of Indigenous peoples, which happened in the past and is still happening today, sets the stage for many of the racial and socioeconomic disparities that appear in environmental justice discourse. But the erasure of Indigenous peoples from environmental discussions also threatens the very fabric of the coastal plain as a crazy quilt of land and water that people have called home since time immemorial. So let me start by saying what I mean by the coastal plain. The Atlantic coastal plain, where I live and work, is relatively flat. It's gently sloping terrain east of the fall line. So the fall line is an ancient high water mark. It's the limit of sea level rise at the last maximum sea level about 3 million years ago. It runs from present-day New Jersey down to Georgia, where it bends westward in a great arc towards the Mississippi River Delta. And the map here shows the North Carolina portion of the Atlantic coastal plain. And you can see where the coastal plain is because it's full of wetlands, which are highlighted in green. Present-day tribal nations in North Carolina are also shown over their approximate present-day territories. This is not meant to supplant or erase the presence of historic tribal nations and tribal peoples. I just want to orient you to where present-day Native peoples live in the coastal plain of North Carolina. You can see here my tribe, the Lumbee. We're a coastal plain people today. Our neighbors, the Waccamaw-Siouan and the Coharie. And then we have a cluster of tribal nations in the northeastern part of the state, the Meherrin, the Haliwa-Saponi, and the Saponi. And then in the Piedmont, we have the Occaneechi band of Saponi Nation. And then I put in parentheses the Catawba Nation because although today they live south of the arbitrarily drawn colonial border through North and South Carolina, their traditional territories extend far into the what's today the North Carolina Piedmont. And our neighbors in the western corner of the state, the Eastern Band of Cherokee, descend from the Cherokee people who traditionally lived as far south as Georgia and over into the southwestern edge of the Appalachians and on up into present-day Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky. So this is certainly Indian country in North Carolina today. Now, there's not always a clear boundary between what's land and water in the coastal plain, especially as we go out towards the coast. This is the Albemarle Sound, one of the larger coastal estuaries in eastern North Carolina. And this is near the head of the sound where it grades into a freshwater swamp. It's near the mouth of the Roanoke River in northeastern North Carolina today. Slightly further inland, there are large freshwater lakes that are ringed with forests of bald cypress trees. These are the trees that are growing up out of the water. They keep their feet wet in the water. Even further inland, the bald cypress trees grow into these massive sizes along Blackwater Streams that drain the coastal plain. So what do I mean by Blackwater Streams? These are waterways that are rich in dissolved organic matter. In fact, that's what gives them their name. The characteristic color from a distance, these waterways look black, but as you get up close to them, they're brown. It's the color of a richly steeped tea. So they're rich in organic matter. They also have seasonally low dissolved oxygen, and they tend to be somewhat acidic. They drain wetlands. Their headwaters tend not to extend beyond the fall line. And so they don't really carry a lot of the sediment and clay and other suspended material that we typically think of when we think of streams in the mountains or the Piedmont. They're often slow-moving streams, but not necessarily so, especially during high water or times of flood. They can actually flow quite vigorously and violently. But in general, the scenes that you see here are what these streams look like through most of the year. So the coastal plain is a watery place, and the indigenous peoples of this region are people of water. Their ancestors lived along all of these rivers, lakes, and estuaries for centuries, or in some cases, millennia. In the 18th and 19th century, the swamps in the interior of the coastal plain became places of refuge and retreat in the face of colonialism. As I said earlier, I belong to the Lumbee tribe. And on the right side of this slide here is a drawing of our 19th century hero, Henry Berry Lowry. We consider him to be a freedom fighter and a source of justice for our people and others in southeastern North Carolina. Today, Lumbee people sometimes refer to themselves as people of the dark water. This is a photo of our namesake river, sometimes called the Lumber River. In 2010, the Lumbee Tribal Council passed an ordinance calling on all entities to refer to the river by its ancestral name, the Lumbee River. There are approximately 60,000 enrolled members of the Lumbee tribe today. So it makes us the largest tribe east of the Mississippi River and one of the 10 largest tribes in the United States. In North Carolina today, somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of all tribally enrolled Native Americans are Lumbees. The Lumbee tribe was partially recognized by a 1956 federal law that affirmed our identity as indigenous peoples, but that same law banned the tribe from holding a government-to-government relationship with the United States. Just to show you a little more about our home territory, this is a map that shows land cover for the Lumbee River Basin. The basin includes all the land that drains into the river upstream of a certain point. This point happens to be a location on the river near the South Carolina state line. The colors on this map represent basic land cover types. Green areas represent forest lands. Brown areas are croplands or pastures. Red and pink areas denote development. There are a couple of small towns in the basin. And then blue areas represent wetlands. And you can see here that you have these blue fingers of wetland. These are riparian swamps that extend all through the basin. In fact, they sort of form the natural grain of the landscape, and you can see them reaching from the southeast towards the northwest. Note the shape and extent of those fingers of wetland. They seem to enclose and encircle different areas of land. And so these wetlands made our territory inaccessible to outsiders. And Lumbees descend from indigenous peoples who gathered along and in between these wetlands throughout much of the 18th century. So following disease, war, and social upheaval that began as early as the late 1500s and continued into the 1700s, Native peoples found their way into places like the Lumbee River Basin. So we're an example of a tribal nation that formed after this first wave of colonization, similar to other tribal nations that exist today, like the Catawba and the Seminole. We are made up of peoples who banded together during the colonial period, and we exist today as tribal entities, whereas Lumbee people did not exist in that form prior to colonization. So by the end of the 18th century, there are very few Lumbee people living, or Lumbee ancestors living in this river basin. By some counts, only a few hundred people living in this in this part of what's now North Carolina. Just to give you a comparison, that the Cherokee Nation around the turn of the 19th century had about 12,000 citizens at that time. So very tiny remnant of people living in the coastal plain that made up the core communities that became the ancestors of Lumbee people. So with so few people living in such an inaccessible and frankly undesirable part of the coastal plain when it came to the expansion of colonialism, Lumbee ancestors were ignored for much of the 18th and early 19th century. It was really not until the coming of railroads in the mid-19th century did we come into contact with the wider world. So here, I want to pause and highlight the title phrase of this talk, "On the Swamp." So "on the swamp" is a casual phrase that Lumbee people use to refer to someone being in the neighborhood or being in the community. Now, Lumbees don't literally live on the swamps of Robeson County. Our communities are located in the interstitial uplands between swamps, between wetlands. But our communities often take the names of the swamps that they sit adjacent to: Saddle Tree, Bear Swamp, Long Swamp, Back Swamp. These are the names of some historic Lumbee communities because they sit adjacent to these particular wetlands. So to be on the swamp is to be around one of these communities. So here you can see part of my father's home place near Saddle Tree Swamp. The ground here is high, flat, and sandy. And down below, you can see Shoe Hill Creek, This is a swamp that's full of hummocks and hollows. And of course, everywhere there are bald cypress trees in the swamps. By the late 19th century, there were schemes underway to exploit the swamps for their timber and to convert drained land for agricultural uses. So there were failed attempts to do this early in the 19th century. But here I want to show you an article that was published in Scientific American in the 1880s that describes the first large-scale deforestation activity in Lumbee homelands. So this was accompanied by draining of wetlands. Briefly, the article highlights the purchase of 100,000 acres of wetland, about 15% of all of Robeson County, and it made up a substantial fraction of the wetlands in the county. So this article actually valorizes the industrialists for defying the locals, whom they describe elsewhere in derogatory language that I won't repeat here. But I pull this quote for you. When the industrialists, when Peters and Butters proposed to cut a canal from Lumber River into the swamp by means of dredges, they were informed by the local oracles that it could not be done. But the thing was done just the same. So the article also hints of the two-step exploitation process. Canals allow industrial machinery into swamps for logging, and they also facilitate drainage of the wetlands, which is an essential part of converting wetlands into croplands. And so here's a second quote. This process will go on until the timber is all cut and the entire swamp converted from a noisome, malarious ooze into cultivable land of the richest kind. So it's really an attempt to not just log the land for its timber, but also to convert it into something fundamentally different from wetlands. So it's interesting to me that this plan emerged at the exact same time that Lumbee ancestors first petitioned Congress for recognition as a tribe. Now that petition focused mainly on resources for schools, and it was denied because of lack of federal funding for tribes at the time. So it turns out that Mr. Peters and Butters were only the beginning of large-scale exploitation of our homelands. For the next several decades, the mid-20th century, there were concerted efforts to dig canals into the Lumbee River wetlands, to log the massive bald cypress forest that remained, and to convert wetlands into arable cropland. Here's some historic photos of drainage underway on the left-hand side with a big steam shovel, and also some pre-drainage surveys that were done in the 1930s. If you look very closely, you can see two people standing in that swamp carrying a rod in transit conducting surveys. So none of this should actually be surprising to environmental scholars or to historians who study the South or other regions where colonialism has been intensive. Exploitation of land and water is part and parcel of the ongoing work of colonialism. But what I think is noteworthy here is that the exploitation occurred right under our ancestors' feet. It's not that Lumbee ancestors were asleep at the wheel, but rather I think it had to do that this was the era of segregation. So what little attention Lumbee ancestors could muster at this time likely focused on schools for their children and on living conditions for Lumbee sharecroppers and tenant farmers. So above on this slide, you can see a wooden structure that was the original building for the institution that became the University of North Carolina at Pembroke, a public school today, but at the time it was founded, it was a school for training of Native American teachers in the Lumbee community. The image below is a Depression era cabin in Robeson County. And I want you to note there a cleanly swept sand yard. That was and still is the mark of a traditionally well-kept Lumbee yard, to sweep it completely clear, not just of leaves and debris, but also of any grass whatsoever. So I want to pause here and reflect on what Indigenous erasure means in a Lumbee context. So for starters, it means that Lumbee people had no say in decisions to ditch and drain the wetlands that have protected and nurtured our communities for centuries. If anything, Lumbees were told that it was going to happen, and perhaps they were told that they could have a chance to buy newly drained farmland or possibly to work as tenant farmers on someone else's newly acquired farm. I'll point out that for most of the 20th century, the majority of Lumbee farmers were sharecroppers or tenant farmers. Only a small fraction actually owned their farms. So for Lumbees, Indigenous erasure often looked like this. While Lumbee people are pursuing visibility or rights in one area, for example, education rights during segregation, other people are going about the work of transforming the landscapes that help to shape our identity as a distinct people. So sometimes that transformation takes the place of ditching, draining, and logging, but it can take other forms as well. So in the 1950s, for example, it looked like Lumbee people being forced to give up parts of their newly acquired farms for natural gas transmission pipelines and related infrastructure to support the pumping of natural gas through Eastern North Carolina. So on the screen now is a map of planned pipeline infrastructure for Eastern North Carolina in the late 1950s. This map was submitted to the North Carolina Utilities Commission just before the construction project went underway. The pipeline network was planned by a group of wealthy white businessmen who traveled to cities and towns throughout Eastern North Carolina, drumming up support for their project. They promised that natural gas would be a panacea to the region's flagging economy. So the pipeline network that's shown here was originally slated to pass through Fayetteville. That is a city about 20 miles north of Robeson County. But a year or two before construction began, the route shifted 20 miles south. So here in the inset image, you can see that there's a point marked Junction A, and that is the heart of a predominantly Lumbee community known as Prospect. So this is what Junction A looked like a few years ago when I visited with a colleague of mine who grew up on the surrounding farm. It's an industrial compound. It's fenced off from the rest of the Lumbee community of Prospect. It's very much an unwelcoming atmosphere with bright glinting razor wire, floodlights, and security cameras. The compound has expanded and changed through the years. And from 2014 until 2020, it was the proposed terminus of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, a 600-mile pipeline that regional energy companies hope to use to bring shale gas from the Appalachian Mountains down to their gas-fired power plants on the coastal plain. So the pipeline would travel right here to this place in Prospect, where it would tie into the company's existing pipeline infrastructure, namely the network of pipelines shown on the previous slide from the 1950s. So the Atlantic Coast Pipeline was actually canceled after widespread public outcry against the project's disproportionately high and adverse impacts on vulnerable communities. But the Atlantic Coast Pipeline was actually not that unusual in that respect. Last year, I led a study with colleagues from NC State and a handful of other universities on the network of natural gas pipelines across the United States. And we found that pipelines tended to be more densely packed in places with high social vulnerability. So the map here shows the pipeline network superimposed over colors that represent the CDC's social vulnerability index for each county. So the CDC defines social vulnerability as the negative effects on a community caused by external stresses on human health. Another way to construe it is the ability of a community to recover whenever disaster strikes. It could be a natural disaster, it could be things like pipeline explosions, or it could be slow, chronic violence like the emanation of pollution from industrial facilities, landfills, things like this. So in this study, we found a correlation between pipeline density and social vulnerability throughout the United States. And what this means is that building new pipelines in socially vulnerable areas like Robeson County can actually reinforce or strengthen this existing pattern. And we argued in the paper that decision makers needed to take this into account before permitting new pipelines like the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. The arguments in our paper were actually based on existing federal environmental justice policy. The EPA, as you can see here, defines that policy as defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people in environmental decision-making. The policy itself hinges on a federal executive order that was issued by Bill Clinton in 1994. That order came after several noteworthy incidents of placing polluting facilities in minority communities. A nationwide study that was conducted in the 1980s confirmed that these were not anecdotal observations, but they were part of a widespread pattern. There are few state-level environmental justice policies, and I would also note that there are no state or federal environmental justice law. So all of environmental justice policy hinges on the executive order at the federal level or state level policies. The Federal Environmental Justice for All bill has been introduced in recent sessions of Congress, and it attempts to remedy this situation of no legal underpinnings for environmental justice policy, but little luck so far. That bill has not passed. So one other noteworthy aspect of environmental justice policy is that it's actually not linked to discriminatory intent. In other words, regulators and proponents of harmful and polluting infrastructure don't have to purposefully place heavy burdens on vulnerable communities in order to run afoul of the aims of environmental justice policy. In fact, the motivation behind the policy is to purposefully avoid doing that. This is important when thinking about places like the Lumbee community of Prospect and plans to put new pipeline infrastructure here. Companies argue that they must site pipelines here because this is where all their other stuff is located. In other words, they argue that they ought to be let off the hook because they don't mean to discriminate against Lumbee people by concentrating their infrastructure in Lumbee communities. But the point remains that environmental justice policy doesn't depend on discriminatory intent. On the other hand, I think it would be interesting and potentially enlightening to dig into the underlying decisions on why the pipeline route was changed in the 1950s to run through the Lumbee community of Prospect instead of through wealthier and wider communities 20 miles north in Fayetteville. In any case, for Lumbees and for Indigenous peoples more generally, environmental justice takes on an additional dimension besides disproportionately high and adverse impacts of pollution and environmental harm on health and well-being. For Indigenous peoples, environmental degradation often comes with cultural loss. We saw this clearly in the case of the Dakota Access Pipeline, where pipeline construction actually harmed sacred sites for Lakota people, and construction took place on miles and miles of treaty land, even though it technically did not cross present-day reservation boundaries. We see things like this happen with Lumbee people too. Federal laws and policies in the United States ostensibly guarantee tribal nations the right to participate in permitting decisions that may impact their cultural resources. But these policies are widely criticized as ineffective or performative or box checking exercises. And in the case of Lumbee people and many of our neighbors in the coastal plain, our recognition status actually prevents us from participating in these decisions at all. Recent federal agencies have cited the 1956 Lumbee Act and its partial recognition of the tribe as a reason for not engaging the tribe in decision-making about environmental permits that have implications for our cultural resources. So this is something important to keep in mind. I want to share one more example with you today when thinking about environmental justice for Indigenous peoples in the context of erasure and transformation of landscapes in the coastal plain of North Carolina. So a few years ago, a regional energy company, the same company that was a major partner in the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, decided to build a massive natural gas processing and storage facility near the site marked Junction A on that 1950s era map. That site is only called Junction A on that map. Most of us know it as Prospect. This facility, because of its size and the potential hazard that it created, required hundreds of acres of land, which the company purchased and clear cut soon afterwards. And so if you look at this image, what you're seeing is actually a former forested land, including forested wetlands that were drained. You can see one of the ditches on the left-hand side of this image, and then logged. And in the background, you can see the storage facility itself under construction. This was taken just a few weeks ago. In the process of clear cutting and then grubbing hundreds of acres of land, the company actually destroyed multiple pre-contact archaeological sites that had been identified decades ago via superficial surveys, but they had never been investigated in full due to lack of resources. So after this land was clear cut, the company sent environmental consultants out to map the sites for compliance with federal Clean Water Act permits. So the consultants looked up the old information on the archaeological sites and went out onto the 600-acre plot to try and locate those sites and assess their condition. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the consultants couldn't find the sites. They had been destroyed by heavy equipment during logging. So even though this event happened in the heart of the Lumbee tribe's traditional territory, there were no requirements whatsoever for the company or for regulators to let the tribe know about the pending activity, the pending deforestation and development. So when I asked a federal regulator why he had not contacted the tribe during any of the proceedings, he said, amazingly, that he assumed the tribe would not have any interest in artifacts that were older than the date of our Congressional Recognition Bill, 1956. And simply put, I think this illustrates how Indigenous erasure manifests in the coastal plain today. Now, of course, there's absolutely no way to know what was lost in the destruction of these sites. The Lumbee Tribal Council held a meeting after they learned about this, about the destruction of these sites. And they brought in corporate officials and frankly raked them over the coals. But there seemed to be little legal recourse. One bright spot in all of this is that the destruction of these sites prompted the Tribal Council to draft a resolution that clearly articulates the tribe's expectations for how corporations and government agencies ought to engage with them prior to future developments that might have negative impacts on the tribe's cultural resources. So these resolutions may not have the force of law, but at a minimum, they can spell out how the tribe expects companies and government agencies to behave when they pursue activities on lands that the tribe considers part of its territory. So I want to wrap up by saying that when I started working on issues related to environmental justice in Lumbee communities and in other tribal communities on the coastal plain, I was overwhelmed by the magnitude of the issues. I was a scientist and I was not trained in environmental justice or frankly in any of the human dimensions of the environment. My academic upbringing is one of a natural scientist. I studied water and I studied ecosystems in places where we purposefully avoided human impacts for reasons that today I still wonder about. I was overwhelmed by the magnitude of the issues that I witnessed in our communities when I saw them through the eyes of a scientist and a scholar. So not only did we have to deal with the legacies of ditching and draining and logging and pipelines, but we also had to contend with massive floods that followed Hurricane Matthew in 2016 and Hurricane Florence in 2018. And in the years since, Lumbees and other vulnerable communities on the coastal plain have had to deal with a new onslaught of industrial livestock operations. In the 1980s, the swine operations overtook the coastal plain. There was a moratorium in North Carolina placed on the number of swine operations in the late 1990s, but in the past few years, industrial poultry operations have begun to explode across the landscape because they're not regulated in the same way that swine operations are. In addition to that, massive slaughterhouses to process all of the poultry have come around as well. So these communities are dealing with not only the waste from the concentrated animal feeding operations, the litter and manure that has to be spread on surrounding crop fields, but the slaughterhouses themselves discharge their partially treated wastewater by spraying it onto former croplands that surround their facilities. In some cases, these spray fields can take up hundreds of acres of land, and they can completely surround the headwaters of small tributaries to the Lumbee River and to other streams. These problems seem to multiply by the day. There didn't seem to be enough expertise to go around. And frankly, I just felt overwhelmed. But the more I worked on these issues and the more time that I spent in communities and in networks, particularly of Indigenous scholars who are working on these issues, I came across others who were intent and dedicated to bringing their expertise to bear on questions that were directly related to or adjacent to issues of erasure and injustice. I'm excited to say that just last week, I traveled back to Prospect with a team of Indigenous scholars. They are soil scientists, hydrologists, data sovereignty experts, education scholars, historians. We spent the day on the swamp. We were in the community. Here we are at the end of our day meeting with a member of the Lumbee Tribal Council on the banks of Shoe Hill Creek, a culturally important site to Lumbee people. Shoe Hill Creek was impounded by a small artificial dam. That dam was breached during the 2 hurricanes, and now Shoe Hill Creek is flowing freely again, but there are remnants of the partially destroyed dam that create a hazard just off to the side of where we are standing. And so the Lumbee tribe, who now owns this property and stewards it as the site of our famous routing of the Ku Klux Klan when they came into our territory and attempted to intimidate us in the late 1950s. This is now a tribally owned property, and they're working on what to do about this partially destroyed dam. Should the mill pond come back through reconstruction of the dam? Should it be left as a free-flowing stream? The adjacent property, how do we memorialize this, this battle that happened 70 years ago. So it was really encouraging to be with such a group of Indigenous scholars who are committed to addressing these issues of erasure and injustice. And then behind us, lanky bald cypress trees, they're everywhere. They're digging their feet deep into the Blackwater. And so this recent trip reminded me that there is yet another generation of scholars coming along to carry the work forward, that I'm frankly thrilled to see what they and others after them are going to do for their people. And I think at institutions like mine and institutions like the University of Georgia, and if you're a scholar in the audience, these institutions where we work, these are places where we can build capacity, not just for Indigenous scholars, but for scholars who are intent on working with their own communities or other communities to address whatever the issues of erasure and injustice look like for them. So with that, I'll wrap up, and I'd be delighted to engage in discussion or take questions that you all have. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ran. That was magnificent and fascinating, and I'm very much looking forward to reading your book, which I think you will share many of these arguments with. And Alfie, if you're there and you'd like to join us to ask questions and join this brief conversation at the end, you're very welcome to. And if you're out there in Zoom land and would like to ask a question, please do through the Q&A function. I'd love to hear from you, and I'll pass on your question to Ryan. Now, Ryan, you kind of, the first question I had for you, and Susan, I'm going to come to you in 1 second. The first question I had to you, I was actually thinking about how to build these sort of capacities, that wonderful group that you had of different kind of scholars and interests. I love the idea of being a data sovereignty expert. It reminded me of a conversation I had recently with the Trust for Public Land. And I wondered, well, sort of two quick questions. What role did NGOs have, or not-for-profit organizations, between tribal communities, universities, and state governments? I've been beginning to think myself recently that it's something that we need to think about a lot more. And then in your book, when you're writing about these stories, if you don't mind sharing us a little bit how you found the ability as a natural scientist and as a Lumbee tribal member to tell these sorts of stories.
Yeah, thank you for those questions. I'll start with NGOs. And I'll start by saying I don't have a lot of experience with NGOs. And I came to the encounters that I had with some trepidation, because I knew that there had been a history of environmental organizations engaging with Indigenous peoples in ways that at times tokenize them, and other times perhaps even exploited them for their own ends. And so I observed mainly through actions related to the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, NGOs acting as agents of multiplying capacity that community members may not have had on their own, in particular in areas related to legal actions. So the community members that I work with were probably in no place on their own to engage in legal actions against this pipeline. But that is the MO of many NGOs, and they have the resources and the expertise to file briefs, to file lawsuits and things like this. And one thing that struck me about these interactions was that they seem to have started a new page in engagements with Indigenous peoples in North Carolina. Now, again, I was not privy to engagements prior to this time, but I got the sense that the organizations that were taking the lead on these lawsuits wanted to invite tribal nations to participate in ways that were appropriate and respectful and not exploitative or extractive. And sometimes that led to, folks were sort of standing around wondering who should talk first. How do we sort of broach that awkward space in between when we want to We want to move respectfully. We may not want to take the first step, but perhaps the tribal government or the community doesn't want to make the first step. Who speaks first in those conversations? And so I didn't have the expertise to broker those conversations, but sort of as an observer, I found that really interesting. And I took it as an encouraging sign that at a minimum, the NGOs weren't looking to tokenize tribal nations, or for that matter, other marginalized communities for specific ends, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
On the topic of writing about these stories in my book, I early on gave up any notion that I was going to structure this book like a typical scientific monograph. I write too many journal articles to commit myself to writing a book that's 8 or 10 more journal articles. So I wanted to do something different, and I'm really grateful that I had editors and peers and mentors who encouraged me to write more freely. I'm not saying that I wrote better or wrote particularly well, but I just felt liberated to break free of that archetype of scientific writing that I've been trained in. And so what I'm trying to do is write stories. Some of them are first-person accounts of my own experiences in places like Prospect, and others are stories that people have entrusted to me and given me permission to tell in the book.
Wonderful. I'm looking forward to it. And can I just say that if you raised your hand in the audience to ask a question, I can't call you up personally, but if you would put your question in the Q&A, I can certainly share that with Ryan, and I know we'd be very happy to answer it. So if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A function. And there I see what has just popped up. So Alan Kovic said, excellent presentation. The Okefenokee Swamp was a refuge for indigenous groups and also encountered the timber industry's interest in Cyprus. They eventually migrated south, and the Seminoles and others lost their land. Now that the National Wildlife Refuge manages the land there are still issues with mining and adjacent development for wood chip production. Are you aware of studies that compare these environmental justice issues in the Okefenokee?
Thank you for that question. I am just learning about some of the mining issues that are happening on or adjacent to the Okefenokee Swamp. And I'm really not aware of the subtleties of environmental justice in these communities. I will point out that people who left Okefenokee Swamp and joined together with the Seminole Nation, this is another interesting aspect of indigenous environmental justice. Today, you will find Seminole people in other parts of the United States, but they still may have ancestral connections to some of these places. And so policies around tribal engagement are supposed to ensure that whether it's a present day territory or an ancestral territories, tribes are afforded an opportunity to participate meaningfully in decision-making processes. And so sometimes for the agencies and for the decision makers involved, the difficulty can be sussing out whose traditional territories are where.
Thank you very much. And Alfie, did you like to ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely. Brian, thank you so much. That was a great presentation. And I also am looking forward to reading some of the upcoming publications as well. I guess my question, I think the graphic you showed overlaying the social vulnerability and the pipelines, I think was, the picture says 1,000 words. It was really, striking to see that relationship and that correlation. And it highlights, of course, the importance of, defending those communities from future encroachments, I guess, from that type of infrastructure that could be threatening. I'm kind of wondering about the flip side of it and whether there are important, relatively intact landscapes in near Lumbee communities that are being worked to conserve and protect any intact landscapes. as a way also to help prevent that future encroachment through some sort of conservation protection.
Yeah, thank you for that. So long stretches of the Lumbee River are nominally protected as a national wild and scenic river. It's the only, in the region, it's the only Blackwater stream, excuse me, that has that designation. One problem with this that I've learned is that it is easy to circumvent that level of protection for things like the nationwide 12 permit, which is that is the same permit that was at the center of the Dakota Access Pipeline, and it's the same pipeline permit that's used all throughout Robeson County to construct these natural gas pipelines. So there's a nominal level of protection for large swaths of the Lumbee River, and it is crucial to keep that habitat intact, not only for ecological reasons, but also for cultural reasons and for water quality reasons. There are many, many reasons to keep that block of riparian wetland intact. But unfortunately, it is shockingly easy to circumvent those levels of protection. I have not seen a good model of what that looks like. There have been efforts in Robeson County to purchase and restore former wetlands. And this is usually done through wetland mitigation banking by entities like the Department of Transportation. Whenever they build or expand a highway and destroy acres of wetland, they have to compensate the mitigation someplace else. And so that they've actually purchased large tracts of land, contiguous tracts in Robeson County, and reflooded plugged the ditches, reflooded, planted bald cypress, done all of the things that are part of the recipe of restoring a wetland. The problem is, as those wetlands recover, they're recovering to different states. Ecologically, they're not the same plant communities. They're not the same animal habitats that they were before. And moreover, most of them are gated off to the communities that surround them. They may have hunting leases to private hunting clubs, but that's usually the only access that people have to these restored wetlands. It's almost a case of fortress conservation, where these are permanently locked up and protected against human encroachment of any kind.
Well, thank you, Ron. And you've been very generous with your time and your experience and your wisdom, really. And I know you're too modest to take credit for that, but really, every time I listen to you, I learn something, and I learned something too from how you communicate. You're so generous with the things you observe. And if you didn't mind, could I ask you one way of finishing up here? I'm always struck by your discovery or your description of the places that you travel through and the sense in which you understand them as known places, as deep places, as felt places. And in a way, I suppose that's where the backgrounds in reading of poetry meets your background in the reading of water science and rivers and thinking about them in two slightly different ways. But there is a connection. And I just thought it's always very powerful for me and for people who don't have access to your kayak and your streams and canoes, just to hear a description of you of what it's like to be out on the water. I nearly died one day whenever you put your beautiful picture and you were out on the Roanoke Sound, I think, and you were there in your kayak. I thought, Lord, I wish I was there with him. But would you mind sharing us a little bit what the experience, and perhaps it's a kind of a transition of you being the scientist in the kayak, is like when you're in these spaces that are familiar to you, and how they become something else in your travel through them?
Yeah, thank you for that. You know, I grew up canoeing and kayaking as a sport and a high adventure recreational pursuit. I loved steep, fast water, and the adrenaline was what made it for me. But in recent years, I've taken a slower approach to boating. Part of it is because I'm getting older, too old to do all of this adrenaline stuff, but also because I, in a way, remember through my parents, my grandparents, and my great-grandparents, and on back through the generations that we are canoe people, we are water people. And even though I'm in a boat made out of plastic or fiberglass, when I'm on the water, I still know that I'm carrying forward those ancient traditions of floating on these streams. These are our ancestral waters, moving through them in a boat that's constructed differently, but I'm feeling the same kinds of currents that my ancestors felt, seeing some of the same views that they saw, taking in the same sounds, the same feel of the water. So for me now, being on the water is a way of reconnecting. You know, we lost our language centuries ago. And so I don't have the neural connections, and I don't have the speech patterns, and I don't have the vocabulary to articulate all of these things in the way that my ancestors articulated them. So when I'm out on the water, I sometimes feel I'm at a complete loss for words, literally, because all of these places, all of these emotions, all these feelings have, they have words and they have names that I don't know, but I can still feel and experience some of the things that my ancestors experienced. And for me, I do it by going to the water.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you so much for giving this year's wonderful Odum lecture. Alfie, thank you for being such a great colleague and for supporting the Environmental Ethics Certificate at the University of Georgia. And again, I want to thank all my colleagues here in the Institute for Native American Studies who do such great work. But above all, Ryan, it's been a pleasure to be with you, and we're very grateful to you. And Duke are very lucky to have you, and the state of North Carolina is very lucky to have you. And I hope that I will get to see you in person soon. But Ryan, thank you so much.
Thank you, Nicholas.